The Blue Moon Saloon reeked of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and the bitter tang of tobacco smoke that hung thick as winter fog. Piano keys clinked out of tune in the corner, the melody stumbling like a drunk man's gait, while boots scraped against sawdust-covered floorboards that had seen too many fights and not enough scrubbing. Oil lamps flickered against the approaching dusk, casting dancing shadows that made every face look either desperate or dangerous. At the center table, 5 men hunched over their cards like vultures over carrion. The pot had grown beyond money, beyond anything resembling civilized wagering. Bills and coins lay scattered among the detritus of the game, empty bottles, cigar stubs, and folded papers that represented deeds, livestock, and promises that would ruin men's lives. But it was what sat chained in the corner that made every soul in the saloon steal glances when they thought no one was watching. A young woman, perhaps 20 years of age, sat with her wrists bound in iron shackles that connected to a heavy chain anchored to the wall. Her dress, once blue calico, was torn at the sleeves and stained with dirt and tears. Auburn hair fell in disheveled waves around a face that held equal parts terror and resignation. She kept her green eyes fixed on the floor, as if looking up might invite worse attention than she'd already received. "I'll see your 100 and raise you the mining claim," wheezed Silas Crenshaw, a fat man whose vest strained against his belly like a dam ready to burst. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the evening chill creeping through the saloon's gaps and cracks. Across from him, Black Pete Morrison, called so for the patch that covered his left eye, fingered his remaining chips with hands stained permanently black from years of handling coal and gunpowder. "Ain't got no more claims, Crenshaw, but I got something worth more than your dirt and rocks." His good eye flicked toward the corner where the young woman sat. The chain around her wrists clinked softly as she shifted, the sound sharp as breaking glass in the sudden quiet that fell over the table. "Now hold on there, Pete," said Doc Holloway, though everyone knew he'd lost his medical license years ago to drink and opium. His hands shook as he reached for his glass. "That weren't part of the original stake." "Original stake's been gone 3 hands back," Pete replied with a grin that showed too many missing teeth. "We're playing for keeps now, ain't we, boys? Besides, what good's a woman to me? I got no use for the gentle sex in my line of work." The 4th player, a rail-thin man named Dutch Carson, whose handlebar mustache twitched when he was nervous, cleared his throat. "She's a person, Pete, not a piece of property to be. Shut your mouth, Dutch, unless you're folding." Pete's voice carried the kind of cold that preceded violence. "In case you forgot, this here's the stakes we all agreed to when we started this game. Everything we own, everything we can lay claim to. That includes her." From her corner, the young woman's head lifted slightly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Met Dutch's for just a moment. He looked away first, shame coloring his cheeks red as autumn leaves. The 5th player had said nothing through the entire exchange. He'd introduced himself only as Samuel when he'd ridden into town that afternoon on a coal-black stallion, dust still clinging to his long coat. Everything about him was dark, his hair, his eyes, even the worn leather of his boots. He wore his gun low on his hip, the way men did when they'd learned to use it for more than show. But there was something else in his manner, a quietness that suggested depths beneath still water. Now Samuel looked up from his cards, his gaze moving deliberately from each man to the woman in the corner, then back to the table. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "What's her name?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Pete blinked, clearly not expecting it. "Her name? What's that matter? A man ought to know what he's playing for. Her name's... Pete started, then stopped, his brow furrowing. Hell, I don't rightly know. Never asked. Got her in trade from some drifter who owed me money. What's it matter what she's called? Samuel's dark eyes found the woman again. She was looking at him now, studying his face with an intensity that suggested she was measuring him the way a person might measure the distance across a dangerous river. Miss, Samuel said, addressing her directly for the first time. Would you tell us your name? Her voice, when it came, was hoarse from disuse but clear. Lydia May Thornton. Miss Thornton. Samuel nodded to her as if they'd met at a church social instead of in a den of vice and desperation. I'm Samuel Blackwood. This is touching as a funeral, Pete snarled, his patience finally fraying. But we got a game to finish. You in or out, Blackwood. Samuel returned his attention to his cards, but not before Lydia saw something flicker across his features. A flash of recognition at her surname, perhaps, or maybe just the kind of anger that good men felt when confronted with evil. She found herself hoping it was the latter. I'm in, Samuel said quietly. He pushed forward a stack of bills that made the other men's eyes widen. But I'm changing the terms. The hell you are, Pete growled. If I win this hand, I take the woman and everything else on this table. But I also take any claims you boys have on her, past, present, or future. She walks free of whatever debts brought her here. Silas wheezed a laugh. And if you lose? Samuel reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch heavy with coin, followed by a folded document. Gold dust from the Colorado fields, $2,000 worth, and the deed to a ranch outside Denver, 300 acres with water rights and a house. The saloon had gone dead quiet. Even the piano player had stopped his clumsy melody to listen. $2,000 was more money than most men in Red Creek would see in a lifetime. You're bluffing, Dutch whispered, but his eyes were fixed on the pouch like a man dying of thirst staring at water. Only one way to find out, Samuel replied. He laid his cards face down on the table. All or nothing, gentlemen, do we have an understanding? One by one, the men nodded, greed overcoming whatever caution they might have possessed. Even Doc Holloway, whose hands shook so badly he could barely hold his cards, managed a jerky nod. Show them, Pete commanded, his voice tight with anticipation. Samuel flipped his cards with deliberate slowness. King of spades, queen of spades, jack of spades, 10 of spades, and finally, the ace of spades, a royal flush. The silence that followed was broken only by Dutch Carson's sharp intake of breath and the distant sound of a coyote howling somewhere in the desert darkness beyond the town's edge. I'll be damned, Silas whispered. Pete's face had gone white, then red, then white again. His good eye darted between the cards and Samuel's impassive features. That's impossible. Nobody gets dealt a hand like that. Are you calling me a cheat? Samuel's voice remained soft, but there was steel underneath it now. Pete's hand moved toward his gun, but Dutch grabbed his wrist. Don't be a fool. Pete, you saw him deal from the deck same as the rest of us. Ain't nobody could stack a deck for a royal flush, not with all of us watching. For a moment, violence hung in the air like the promise of a storm. Then Pete slumped back in his chair, the fight going out of him all at once. Son of a... Yeah, all right. You won fair and square. Samuel gathered the money and deeds without ceremony. But his eyes were on Lydia. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly. But something else underneath it. Not gratitude exactly, but a kind of desperate hope that hurt to see. He stood slowly, the chair scraping against the floor, and walked over to where she sat chained. Up close. He could see the bruises on her wrists where the iron had chafed, the hollow look in her cheeks that spoke of too little food and too much fear. "Miss Thornton," he said, crouching down so their eyes were level. "Those chains got a key?" Pete tossed a small iron key across the floor. It skittered to a stop near Samuel's boots. "There's your prize, Blackwood. Hope she's worth bankrupting yourself for." Samuel picked up the key but didn't immediately use it. Instead, he studied Lydia's face in the lamplight. "I want you to know," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I didn't win you to own you. Soon as we're clear of this place, you can go wherever you please. But if you'll permit me, I'd like to see you somewhere safe first." Something shifted in her green eyes, surprise giving way to something that might have been the first stirring of trust. She nodded once, a quick, sharp movement. The key turned easily in the lock, and the chains fell away with a clatter that seemed to echo through the entire saloon. Lydia rubbed her wrists, wincing at the raw skin beneath. "Can you ride?" Samuel asked. "Yes, sir." "Good." He stood and offered her his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, her fingers small and cold in his calloused palm. "There's a spare horse outside. We'll get you somewhere you can rest and figure out what comes next." As they made their way toward the saloon doors, Pete called out from behind them. "Don't think this is over, Blackwood. That girl's got enemies you can't even imagine. You may have won her fair and square, but keeping her alive? That's a whole different game." Samuel paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the doorframe. Without turning around, he replied, "Then I guess we'll see how well I play it." The desert night air was cool and clean after the staleness of the saloon. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns as old as time, and somewhere in the distance, that same coyote called again, wild and free and answering to no master. Lydia May Thornton took her first breath of free air in months and wondered if the man beside her truly understood what he'd just gotten himself into. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the eastern mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Samuel had stayed awake through the night, keeping watch while Lydia slept fitfully on a makeshift bed of saddle blankets near the dying fire. She'd tossed and turned, murmuring words he couldn't catch, fighting battles in her dreams that he understood all too well. Now she sat near the window, braiding her auburn hair with fingers that trembled only slightly in the morning light. The simple act of grooming herself seemed to give her strength, as if each twist of the braid was binding her resolve as much as her hair. "We can't stay here much longer," Samuel said, pouring coffee from a battered pot into 2 tin cups. "Someone's bound to come looking, either for us or just stumbling across this place." Lydia accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm metal. "Where would we go?" "Depends on what you've decided and if you're still set on running. I know people in California who could help you disappear. New name, new life, far from the Crimson Hand's reach. And if I'm not, then we need to talk about that evidence your father hid, where it is, what it contains, and how we can use it to bring down Crow and his entire operation." She was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee as if the answers might be floating in the dark liquid. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tired. "There's more to it than I told you last night." Samuel set down his cup and waited. He'd learned long ago that the truth had its own pace, and pushing only made people clam up tighter. "The reason my father was able to get so close to the Crimson Hand," she continued, "wasn't just because he was a good lawman. It was because he had help from the inside. An informant? More than that." She looked up at him, and he could see the weight of secrets in her green eyes. Papa wasn't just investigating the hand's connection to corrupt officials. He was investigating corruption in the Marshal Service itself. The implication hit Samuel like a physical blow. You're saying there were federal marshals working with the Crimson Hand? At least 3 that Papa could prove. Maybe more. Men who were supposed to be hunting outlaws but were actually protecting them, feeding them information about raids, warning them when possess were forming, even helping them plan attacks on rival gangs. Samuel felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. If federal marshals were compromised, then the entire law enforcement structure in the territories was suspect. No wonder the Crimson Hand had been able to operate with such impunity. Deputy Marshal William Hayes, Lydia said, naming the first name on her father's list. Papa caught him passing information to a hand lieutenant named Marcus Graves. Hayes had been telling them which wagon trains were carrying the most valuable cargo. The name Hayes meant nothing to Samuel, but he filed it away. Who else? Marshal Frank Morrison, no relation to the judge in Santa Fe. He was taking money to look the other way when the Hand moved stolen goods through Tucson. And Deputy Marshal Robert Stone, who was actually helping them plan raids on silver shipments from the mines. 3 federal lawmen, sworn to uphold justice, betraying their oaths for money. The scope of the corruption was staggering. That's why they're so desperate to silence you, Samuel realized. It's not just about the evidence against the Hand. It's about protecting their people inside the Marshal Service. Papa documented everything. Names, dates, amounts of money, even copies of some of the messages that passed between the Marshals and the Hand. He said it was enough to not only destroy the Crimson Hand but to trigger a complete investigation of the Territorial Marshal Service. Samuel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the empty landscape. The magnitude of what they were dealing with was starting to become clear. This wasn't just about revenge against a gang of outlaws. This was about exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial law enforcement. Where did your father hide all this evidence? Lydia hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. There's an old Spanish mission about 40 miles north of Santa Fe, Mission San Miguel. Papa and I used to go there sometimes when I was little. He said it reminded him of churches back in Missouri where he grew up. The place has been abandoned for 20 years. But the bell tower is still standing. He hid it in the mission? In the bell tower. There's a loose stone about 6 feet up from the floor on the north wall. Behind it. Papa built a waterproof container with all the documents, photographs, even some of the actual silver coins the marshals took as bribes. Samuel turned back to face her. And you're the only person who knows about this? The only person still alive? Yes. Papa made me memorize the location and the exact way to find the hiding spot. He said if anything happened to him, I was to retrieve the evidence and get it to someone he trusted completely. Like Marshal Williams in Denver or Judge Morrison in Santa Fe. Except I don't know if I can trust them anymore. If 3 marshals were corrupt, how do I know there aren't more? How do I know Williams isn't taking money from the Hand too? It was a fair point, and one that made their situation even more precarious. The evidence could destroy the Crimson Hand, but only if they could get it to someone who wasn't already compromised. There's something else, Lydia said, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. Something I've never told anyone. Samuel waited. Papa didn't just hide evidence of the corruption. He also hid something that belonged to the Hand. Something they want back even more than they want me dead. What kind of something? Lydia set down her coffee cup and clasped her hands together, her knuckles white with tension. Have you ever heard of the Bisbee mine payroll robbery? Samuel nodded. It had been one of the most audacious heists in territorial history. Over $50,000 in gold stolen from a heavily guarded train. The Crimson Hand had been suspected, but nothing was ever proven. The Hand didn't just steal the gold, Lydia continued. They stole the entire payroll ledger, a book that contained not just information about mine operations, but also details about bribes paid to territorial officials, judges, even some congressmen back in Washington. Your father got his hands on this ledger? He intercepted it during a raid on a Hand hideout near Tucson. The gang members were all killed in the shootout, so they never reported back that the ledger was missing. Papa realized what he had. Not just evidence of the mine robbery, but proof of political corruption that reached all the way to the territorial capital. Samuel sat back down, his mind racing. So the evidence your father hid includes not only proof that federal marshals were working with the Hand, but also a ledger that could implicate territorial officials and Washington politicians. That's why they want me so badly, Lydia said. It's not just about keeping their own secrets. They're also protecting powerful people who could destroy them if the truth came out. The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear now. The Crimson Hand wasn't just a gang of outlaws. They were the enforcement arm of a corruption network that reached into every level of government in the territory. And the evidence to prove it was sitting in a ruined Spanish mission, waiting for someone brave enough to retrieve it. There's one more thing, Lydia said, and something in her tone made Samuel look at her sharply. What? The ledger contains a list of everyone who's taken money from the Hand or their associates. Politicians, judges, business owners, even some newspaper editors who've been paid to keep certain stories out of their papers. She paused, studying his face carefully. It also contains a list of everyone who's ever crossed them. People they've marked for death. People whose families they've threatened. People they've hurt to send a message to others. Samuel felt cold dread creeping up his spine. Lydia, your sister's name is in that ledger. Samuel. Rebecca Blackwood. And the reason she was killed wasn't random. The Crimson Hand targeted that wagon train specifically because someone had paid them to eliminate a family named Blackwood. The words hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt sideways and he had to grip the edge of the wooden crate to keep from falling. That's impossible, he whispered. Rebecca was just a girl traveling to California. She never hurt anyone, never got involved in anything that would make her a target. It wasn't her they were after, Lydia said gently. It was your family. According to the ledger, someone paid the Hand $5,000 to make sure no one with the last name Blackwood ever made it to California alive. Samuel's mind reeled. All these years, he'd believed that Rebecca had been the victim of a random attack by outlaws. The idea that she'd been specifically targeted, that someone had paid for her death, was almost too much to process. Who, he managed to say, who paid them? The ledger just lists initials and an amount, J.B. $5,000, Blackwood family elimination. But Papa had a theory. He thought it might be connected to a mining claim dispute your family was involved in before you left Missouri. Samuel's thoughts flew back to those last days in Missouri, before Rebecca had decided to try her luck in the California goldfields. There had been a dispute over a claim his late father had filed, something about boundaries and prior rights. A man named Joseph Brennan had contested the claim, saying the Blackwood family had filed false papers. The dispute had gotten ugly, with accusations of fraud and threats of legal action. Samuel had thought it was just another greedy man trying to steal what didn't belong to him. He'd never imagined it would follow them across half the continent. Brennan, he said, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. Joseph Brennan. You know him? I know of him. He tried to steal our father's mining claim after Pa died when we left Missouri. I thought that was the end of it. Apparently not. According to Papa's notes, Brennan has been using the hand to eliminate people who stood in the way of his business interests. Your family wasn't the first, and they weren't the last. Samuel stood abruptly and walked to the fireplace, bracing his hands against the stone mantel. Everything he'd believed about Rebecca's death had been a lie. She hadn't died because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She died because a greedy man with connections to killers had wanted to make sure the Blackwood family never challenged his claim to their father's land. I'm sorry, Lydia said quietly. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. No, Samuel said, his voice hard as iron. It's exactly what I needed to hear. He turned to face her, and she could see something new in his dark eyes, not just grief and anger, but cold, purposeful rage. How sure are you about the location of this evidence? Completely sure. I could find it blindfolded. And you're certain it contains everything you've described? The proof about the corrupt marshals, the mine payroll ledger, the list of people they've targeted? Everything. Papa was meticulous about documentation. He knew that if he was going to bring down something this big, he needed evidence that would stand up in any court in the territory. Samuel nodded slowly. Then we're going to get it. Samuel, it's too dangerous. The mission is probably being watched. Even if we could get there undetected, how would we know who to trust with the evidence once we have it? We'll figure that out when we get there. But first, we're going to retrieve everything your father died to protect. And then we're going to use it to destroy the Crimson Hand and everyone who's been protecting them. He walked back to her and knelt down so they were eye to eye. I want you to understand something. Lydia, this isn't just about justice anymore. This is personal. They killed my sister to protect a lie, and they've been hunting you to cover up their crimes. They've turned law enforcement into a tool for their own profit, and they've corrupted everything that's supposed to protect innocent people. She could see the fire burning in his eyes now, not the wild flame of revenge, but the steady burn of determination. I'm going to Mission San Miguel, he continued, with or without you, but I'd rather have you with me, because you know exactly where to find what we need, and because I think you deserve the chance to finish what your father started. Lydia looked at him for a long moment, this dark stranger who had risked everything to free her from chains, who had listened to her story without judgment, who was now offering her something she'd thought lost forever, the chance to strike back at the people who had destroyed her life. When do we leave? She asked. As soon as we can get our gear together and plan a route that keeps us clear of the main roads. It's going to be dangerous, and there's a good chance we won't make it back alive. I've been dead for 2 years already, Lydia said quietly. At least this way, my death might mean something. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the stark beauty of the desert landscape. It was going to be a clear day for traveling, and a clear day for the kind of reckoning that had been 5 years in the making. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as they prepared to leave the abandoned mining shack. Samuel checked his rifle and pistol with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that survival often depended on such details. Lydia watched him work, noting the way his hands moved with quiet confidence, the careful attention he paid to every cartridge and every moving part. You handle those weapons like a soldier, she observed. Was one for a time. Samuel finished loading his rifle and leaned it against the wall. Served with the Union Army during the war, Colorado volunteers, mostly fighting Confederate raiders and hostile tribes along the Santa Fe Trail. It explained a lot, the way he carried himself, the quiet authority in his voice, the calculating way he approached problems. But there was something else in his manner, something that spoke of battles fought long after the war had officially ended. "Is that where you learned to track outlaws?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the harsh beauty of the desert landscape. "That came later, after Rebecca." Lydia sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't push. They all had their ghosts in this country, their private wars that continued long after the public ones had ended. "Tell me about your sister," she said gently. Samuel's hand stilled on his gear. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he began to speak, his voice low and distant. "Rebecca she was everything good in the world, kind, optimistic, always seeing the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. After our parents died, she was all the family I had left." He moved to his saddlebags, checking their supplies with movements that had become automatic. "The war took a lot out of me. I came home different than when I left. Harder, I suppose. Angrier. Rebecca was the one thing that kept me anchored to who I used to be. She wanted to go to California, wanted to teach school out there. Said the frontier needed teachers as much as it needed soldiers and miners. She'd read stories about the gold rush towns, about children growing up without any proper education, and she was determined to do something about it." Samuel's voice carried a mixture of pride and pain that Lydia recognized. The way people talked about loved ones who had died too young, too full of unrealized dreams. "I tried to talk her out of it," he continued. "The journey was dangerous, especially for a young woman traveling with strangers. But Rebecca had made up her mind, and when she set her heart on something, there was no changing it." "So you let her go?" "I did more than that. I found what I thought was the safest wagon train, led by a man named Captain Morrison, good reputation, experienced guide, well-armed guards. I even paid extra to make sure she had a place in one of the better wagons, with a family that promised to look after her." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I thought I was protecting her, thought I was giving her the best chance of making it safely to her new life. What happened?" "The Crimson Hand hit the train about 3 days out from Albuquerque. It was perfectly planned. They knew exactly when the train would be passing through Devil's Canyon. Knew how many guards there were. Knew which wagons carried the most valuable cargo." He paused in his packing, his hands clenched into fists. "Later, I found out they'd been watching the train for weeks, following it from a distance, waiting for the right moment to strike. They knew everything about the passengers, including the fact that there was a young school teacher traveling alone." Lydia felt a chill run down her spine. "They targeted her specifically?" "Not at first. The initial attack was just robbery. Take the money and valuables, maybe some of the livestock, then disappear into the Badlands. But when Crow saw Rebecca..." Samuel's voice trailed off. "You don't have to continue." "Yes, I do." His voice was firm. "You need to understand what kind of man we're dealing with." "What kind of monster?" Samuel sat down heavily on one of the wooden crates, his shoulders sagging with the weight of old grief. "The other survivors said Crow took one look at Rebecca and changed the entire plan. Instead of a quick robbery, he decided to take prisoners. Specifically, he decided to take her." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Lydia had heard enough stories about the Crimson Hand to know what that meant, but hearing it applied to someone specific, someone loved, made it somehow worse. "The other passengers were released after 3 days," Samuel continued. "Crow kept them just long enough to make his point, to show them what happened to people who traveled through his territory without paying tribute. But Rebecca... Samuel, you don't... She was missing for 3 weeks. His voice was flat now, emotionless in the way of men who had pushed past the point where feelings could be safely expressed. 3 weeks while I rode myself and my horse nearly to death searching every canyon, every hideout, every rumored location where the Hand might be holding prisoners. Did you find her? I found where they'd kept her, an old mining camp up in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. By the time I got there, it was already abandoned. But there were signs, evidence of what they'd done. Samuel stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to Lydia. I found her body 2 days later, about 5 miles from the camp. They'd thrown her in a ravine like she was garbage. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Lydia could see the tension in Samuel's shoulders, the rigid way he held himself, as if relaxing his guard for even a moment might allow the grief to overwhelm him. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I know those words don't mean much, but I'm truly sorry for your loss." "The worst part," Samuel said without turning around, "was finding out later that it could have been prevented. If the federal marshals had been doing their jobs instead of taking bribes from the very people they were supposed to be hunting, Rebecca would still be alive." Now Lydia understood the true depth of his anger. It wasn't just about revenge against the Crimson Hand. It was about a system so corrupt that innocent people died while the very men sworn to protect them profited from their deaths. "After I buried her," Samuel continued, "I made myself a promise. I would track down every member of the Crimson Hand, starting with the foot soldiers and working my way up to Crow himself. And I would make them pay for what they'd done, not just to Rebecca, but to all the other innocents they'd hurt. That was 5 years ago. 5 years of following cold trails and false leads. 5 years of watching Crow stay one step ahead of every posse, every bounty hunter, every federal marshal who wasn't already in his pocket." Samuel turned back to face her, and she could see the frustration burning in his dark eyes. "Do you know how many people that man has killed in 5 years? How many families he's destroyed? Too many. And all the while, he's been protected by corrupt lawmen who warn him when raids are coming, who help him move stolen goods, who make sure witnesses disappear before they can testify against him." Samuel moved back to his gear, his movements sharp with suppressed anger. "I've killed 11 members of the Crimson Hand in the past 5 years. 11 men who thought they could torture and murder innocent people without consequences. But for everyone I put in the ground, 2 more take their place. Because the leadership is still intact." "Exactly. Cut off the head of a snake, and the body dies. But as long as Crow is alive, as long as his lieutenants are free to recruit new men and his corrupt contacts are protecting him, the Crimson Hand will keep growing stronger." Lydia watched him work, understanding now why he had been so determined to win her freedom, why he was willing to risk everything on what seemed like an impossible mission. This wasn't just about justice, it was about redemption, a chance to finally succeed where he had failed before. "You blame yourself for Rebecca's death," she said quietly. Samuel's hand stilled on his rifle. "I should have protected her. You couldn't have known what would happen. Couldn't I?" His voice was bitter. "I was a soldier, Lydia. I'd seen what men were capable of when they thought no one was watching. I'd seen what happened to civilians caught in the path of violent men, and I still let her go. Because you loved her. Because you wanted her to have the life she dreamed of. Because I was a fool who thought money and good intentions were enough to keep evil at bay." Lydia stood and moved closer to him, close enough to see the pain etched in the lines around his eyes. "You're not the same man who let his sister go west with a wagon train. 5 years of hunting killers has changed you. Has it changed me enough? I don't know. But I know that sitting in that saloon, chained like an animal, I'd given up hope. I was ready to die. And then you walked in and reminded me that there are still good men in this world. Men willing to risk everything for a stranger." Samuel looked at her directly for the first time since he'd begun talking about Rebecca. "I didn't save you to be good, Lydia. I saved you because you're my best chance of getting close enough to Crow to put a bullet in his brain." "Maybe that's how it started," she agreed. "But that's not how it ended. When you unlocked those chains, when you told me I was free to go wherever I wanted, that was about more than just using me as bait." Samuel didn't deny it, but he didn't confirm it either. Instead, he shouldered his rifle and checked the loads in his pistol one final time. "We should go," he said. "We've got 40 miles of hard riding ahead of us, and I want to reach the mission before nightfall tomorrow." Lydia gathered her few possessions. The torn calico dress was all she owned in the world, and prepared to follow him out into the desert heat. But first, she had one more question. "Samuel, when this is over, when we've retrieved the evidence and exposed the corruption, what happens then? What happens to you?" He paused at the doorway, silhouetted against the blazing afternoon sun. "I suppose that depends on whether we survive long enough to find out." "And if we do survive?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the vast emptiness of the territorial landscape. "For 5 years, everything I've done has been about Rebecca, about making the people who killed her pay for their crimes. I don't know who I am when that's finished. Maybe you'll find out you're the kind of man who deserves a chance at something better than revenge. Maybe." He stepped out into the sunlight, then turned back to her. "But first, we have work to do." As they mounted their horses and rode away from the abandoned mining shack, Lydia found herself thinking about chains, not just the iron ones that had bound her wrists, but the invisible ones that bound people to their past, to their grief, to their need for vengeance. Samuel had freed her from one kind of bondage, but both of them were still prisoners of another sort. Perhaps, if they were very lucky and very brave, they would find a way to break those chains too. But first, as Samuel had said, they had work to do. The kind of work that might cost them their lives, but might also give meaning to their deaths. The desert stretched endlessly ahead of them, beautiful and merciless as only the frontier could be. Somewhere out there, beyond the mountains and the heat and the endless sky, lay a ruined Spanish mission that held the key to destroying the most dangerous criminal organization in the territory. And beyond that, if they survived long enough to reach it, lay the kind of reckoning that had been 5 years in the making. The ruins of Mission San Miguel rose from the desert floor like the bones of some ancient beast, weathered stone walls standing sentinel against the endless sky. They had reached the mission just as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the crumbling adobe in shades of gold and amber. From their vantage point on a ridge half a mile away, Samuel studied the abandoned structure through a small brass telescope he'd carried since his army days. "Looks empty," he said, lowering the instrument. "But that doesn't mean it is." Lydia crouched beside him among the scattered rocks and desert brush, her eyes fixed on the bell tower that had haunted her dreams for 2 years. So close now. The evidence that could destroy the Crimson Hand and avenge her father's death lay just beyond those crumbling walls. Yet she had never felt further from her goal. "They could be watching from anywhere," she said quietly. "The Hand has eyes everywhere in this territory." Samuel nodded grimly. During their ride north, they had passed 3 separate groups of riders heading in various directions, too far away to identify, but close enough to remind them that they were not alone in this vast wilderness. Any one of those groups could have been Crimson Hand scouts, or bounty hunters drawn by the price on Lydia's head, or even corrupt marshals working to protect their own interests. We wait until dark, Samuel decided. Approach from the north side where the walls have collapsed. Get in, find your father's cache, and get out before dawn. And if we're caught, Samuel's hand moved instinctively to the Colt at his hip, then we make them pay dearly for the privilege. They settled in to wait as the day slowly died around them. The desert evening brought its own sounds, the distant cry of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, the whisper of wind through stone. But underneath it all was a tension that made every shadow seem threatening, every sound potentially dangerous. As full darkness finally settled over the landscape, Samuel made his decision. It's time. They moved carefully down the ridge, leading their horses rather than riding them. The animals' hooves were wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound, and they had chosen a route that would keep them hidden in the shadows of larger rock formations. Every 50 yards. Samuel stopped to listen, his head cocked like a hunting wolf testing the air for danger. The mission walls loomed larger as they approached, and Lydia could see details that distance had hidden. Bullet holes pockmarked the adobe where some long-ago battle had been fought. Wooden crosses that had once marked graves lay scattered and broken. The place felt heavy with old sorrows, as if the very stones remembered the violence that had driven away the faithful. The entrance to the bell towers on the eastern side, Lydia whispered as they crept along the northern wall. Papa said the stairs are stone, built into the wall itself, so they should still be solid. Samuel nodded, his rifle ready in his hands. They had discussed the plan during their long ride: get to the tower, retrieve the evidence, and disappear into the night. Simple in concept, but Samuel had learned long ago that simple plans had a way of becoming complicated very quickly. They reached the gap in the northern wall where weather and time had brought down a section of stone. Beyond lay the mission's central courtyard, overgrown with desert plants and littered with debris. The bell tower stood at the far end, its arched openings dark as empty eye sockets. "Stay close," Samuel breathed, and they slipped through the gap. The courtyard was perhaps 50 yards across, dotted with the remains of what had once been a garden. Lydia could make out the crumbling outline of stone paths, the skeletal remains of wooden structures that might have been prayer benches or work tables. In the center, a well covered by an iron grate reminded her uncomfortably of the chains she had so recently worn. They had made it halfway across the courtyard when Samuel suddenly raised his hand, bringing them to an immediate halt. He had heard something, or perhaps felt it, the way experienced fighters sometimes sensed danger before it became visible. From somewhere in the darkness beyond the mission walls came the soft nicker of a horse. Samuel's blood turned to ice water. They were not alone. He motioned for Lydia to get down, and they both crouched behind the remains of a stone bench. Samuel strained his ears, trying to determine how many riders were out there, where they were positioned, whether they had been spotted. The answer came in the form of a voice carried on the still night air, a man's voice, speaking low but audible in the desert quiet. Tracks led right to the ridge, fresh tracks, 2 horses. Another voice, rougher, answered. Could be anyone. Lot of travelers use this route. Could be, but the boss said to watch this place special. Said if the Thornton girl was gonna show up anywhere, it'd be here. Samuel felt Lydia tense beside him. The Crimson Hand was here, waiting, just as they had feared. Worse, it sounded like they had been watching the mission for some time, prepared for exactly this possibility. A third voice joined the conversation, and this one sent a chill down Samuel's spine because he recognized it. Jeremiah Crow himself, the leader of the Crimson Hand, was somewhere out there in the darkness. "Marcus, take 3 men and circle around to the south wall. Johnny, you and Bill cover the east entrance. Nobody goes in or out of that mission without my say-so." Samuel closed his eyes and cursed silently. They had walked into a trap, and now they were pinned down in the middle of an open courtyard with limited cover and no obvious escape route. Worse, they were outnumbered by professional killers who knew the terrain and had planned for this contingency. But as he listened to the sound of men moving into position around the mission, Samuel began to form a different kind of plan, a desperate plan, but one that might give them not just the evidence they needed, but something even more valuable, a chance to end the Crimson Hand once and for all. He leaned close to Lydia's ear, his voice barely audible. "Change of plans. What do you mean? They're expecting us to try to sneak in and out. What they're not expecting is for us to spring our own trap." Even in the darkness, he could see her eyes widen with alarm. "Samuel, there are at least 6 of them out there, probably more, and Crow himself is with them." "Exactly. When are we ever going to get another chance to take him out?" "It's suicide." "Maybe. But if we can get the evidence and eliminate Crow at the same time, we solve both problems at once." Samuel's mind was racing now, calculating angles and distances, remembering lessons learned in too many firefights during the war. The mission's layout actually gave them some advantages. The thick stone walls would provide cover. The multiple rooms and passages would allow them to move without being seen, and the bell tower itself could serve as a fortress if they could reach it. "Here's what we're going to do," he whispered. "You're going to the tower to get the evidence, just like we planned, but you're going to make some noise doing it, not too much, just enough to let them know someone's inside. And then they'll come in after you, and when they do, I'll be waiting." Lydia grabbed his arm. "You can't fight 6 armed men by yourself. I won't be fighting 6 men. I'll be fighting them 1 or 2 at a time, in narrow passages where their numbers won't help them." The mission was built like a fortress. It's designed to be defended by a small force against a larger one. It was true. Spanish missions in hostile territory had been constructed with defense in mind. Thick walls, narrow doorways, limited sight lines, all features that would favor defenders over attackers. And if something goes wrong, Samuel reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch. "Gold dust, enough to get you to California and start a new life. If I don't make it out, you take the evidence and ride hard for Denver. Find someone you trust and make sure the truth gets told." Lydia stared at the pouch, then looked back at his face. "I'm not leaving you. If I'm dead, there's no point in both of us dying. And if you're not dead," Samuel managed a grim smile, "then we'll have accomplished something worth dying for." Before she could argue further, he was moving, staying low as he made his way toward the eastern wall where the main entrance to the bell tower stood. Lydia watched him disappear into the shadows, then began her own careful approach to the tower. The entrance was exactly where her father had described it, an arched doorway that had once held wooden doors, now long since rotted away or burned. Stone stairs spiraled upward along the inner wall, disappearing into darkness above. Lydia paused at the threshold, listening for any sound that might indicate the tower was occupied. Nothing. She began to climb, counting steps as her father had taught her. 23 steps to the first landing, where narrow windows looked out over the desert. Another 15 steps to the second landing, and finally, 12 more steps to the bell chamber itself. The chamber was empty except for the massive iron framework that had once held the mission bell. Moonlight streamed through the arched openings, creating a pattern of light and shadow on the stone floor. Lydia moved to the north wall and began counting stones upward from the floor. 6 feet up, just as her father had said, she found the loose stone. It moved slightly when she pressed against it, and she was able to work her fingers around the edges and pull it free. Behind it was a cavity about the size of a man's head, and within that cavity was a canvas-wrapped bundle sealed with wax. Her father's evidence. 2 years of running, 2 years of fear and death and constantly looking over her shoulder. And it all came down to this, a package small enough to hold in 2 hands. As she lifted it from its hiding place, a sound from below made her freeze. Footsteps on the stone stairs. Heavy boots moving with the confidence of men who believed they had their quarry trapped. Samuel had been right. The Crimson Hand was coming. Lydia clutched the evidence to her chest and moved to one of the arched openings, looking down into the courtyard. She could see shapes moving in the darkness, armed men spreading out to surround the tower. At least 5, maybe 6. Where was Samuel? The footsteps were closer now, perhaps halfway up the tower. In moments, they would reach the bell chamber, and then a gunshot exploded from somewhere within the mission, followed immediately by a man's scream of pain. Then another shot, and another, the reports echoing off the stone walls like thunder. The footsteps on the stairs stopped abruptly. Lydia heard voices conferring in urgent whispers, then the sound of boots retreating quickly downward. Samuel had sprung his trap, from her position in the tower. Lydia could see muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness as gunfire erupted throughout the mission complex. Samuel had been right about the tactical advantages. The narrow passages and thick walls were preventing the Crimson Hand from bringing their full force to bear, forcing them to fight on his terms instead of their own. But for how long? Another scream echoed through the night, and Lydia saw a man stumble out of the main building, clutching his shoulder. That was at least 2 of them down, but she could still see others moving in the shadows, trying to coordinate their assault. Then she heard a voice that made her blood run cold. Jeremiah Crow, shouting orders from somewhere near the main entrance. "Burn them out! Marcus, get some torches! We'll smoke the bastard out of there!" Fire. The one thing Samuel couldn't fight from inside the stone buildings. If they set the mission ablaze, the smoke alone would force him into the open where their superior numbers would overwhelm him. Lydia looked at the evidence in her hands, then at the dark courtyard below where men were already moving to implement Crow's orders. She had what they had come for, and Samuel had told her to run if things went badly on Modun, but she couldn't. Not when he was down there fighting alone. Not when he had risked everything to free her from chains. Not when he was about to die for her father's cause. She secured the evidence inside her dress and began to make her way back down the tower stairs. She might not be a gunfighter, but there were other ways to help. And if Samuel was determined to make his stand here, in this ruined mission in the middle of nowhere, then at least he wouldn't make it alone. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, another volley of gunfire erupted from the main building. But this time, she thought she heard something else mixed in with the shooting, the sound of men calling out in confusion and alarm. Samuel was giving them a fight they hadn't expected. The question was whether it would be enough. Clutching her father's evidence tight against her chest, Lydia Thornton stepped out into the courtyard and prepared to find out. Raven Shallow Mansion crouched against the desert hillside like some predatory beast, its dark stone walls rising from the scrub brush and red earth as if they had grown there naturally. The building was an anomaly in this harsh landscape, too grand for the frontier, too imposing for the middle of nowhere, yet perfectly suited to a man who ruled through fear and violence. Samuel and Lydia lay hidden among the rocks on a ridge overlooking the mansion, studying the fortress that Jeremiah Crow had made his seat of power. The building sprawled across several terraced levels carved into the hillside, connected by covered walkways and guarded by stone watchtowers that commanded views of the surrounding desert for miles in every direction. "How many men do you count?" Samuel asked quietly, lowering his telescope. Lydia had been watching the guards patrol the perimeter. At least 20 visible, probably twice that many inside. They change watch every 2 hours, always in pairs, and they've got rifle positions on all the high points. It had taken them 3 days to reach this place after their escape from Mission San Miguel. 3 days of hard riding through terrain that seemed designed to break both horses and men, following trails that existed more in Samuel's memory than on any map. The mission had been a bloodbath. Samuel had accounted for 4 of Crow's men before a lucky shot had creased his shoulder and forced him to retreat. But they had gotten what they came for, and more importantly, they had lived to fight another day. The evidence Lydia's father had hidden was now secured in Samuel's saddlebags, wrapped in oiled leather and canvas to protect it from the elements. Documents that could destroy not just the Crimson Hand, but the entire network of corruption that protected them. All they needed now was a way to get it to someone who could use it, and a way to ensure that Jeremiah Crow never hurt another innocent person. That was where their desperate plan came in. "You sure about this?" Samuel asked, not for the first time since they had hatched this scheme. Lydia fingered the iron shackles they had retrieved from the abandoned mining shack, the same chains that had bound her in the Blue Moon Saloon, now cleaned and polished to look convincing. "It's the only way to get close enough to him. Crow's been hunting me for 2 years. If he thinks he's finally captured me, his guard will be down. And if he doesn't believe the story, then we die. But at least we die fighting instead of running." Samuel studied her face in the fading afternoon light. Over the past few days, he had watched her transform from a frightened victim into something harder, more determined. The woman who had sat chained in that saloon was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required becoming as dangerous as the people hunting you. Their plan was simple in its audacity. Samuel would approach the mansion alone, claiming to be a bounty hunter who had captured the infamous Lydia Thornton. He would demand an audience with Crow himself, insisting on dealing only with the top man for such a valuable prize. Once inside, he would create enough confusion to allow Lydia, who would be hidden nearby, to infiltrate the building and plant evidence that would implicate Crow's political allies in territory government. It was a plan with about a dozen ways to go wrong and only one way to succeed. But it was also their only chance to get close enough to Crow to end this once and for all. As the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, they made their final preparations. Samuel checked his weapons one more time, ensuring that his rifle and pistol were fully loaded and that the spare ammunition was easily accessible. He had also prepared several surprises, small bundles of black powder wrapped in paper and equipped with short fuses, remnants of his army training that might prove useful in close quarters. Lydia reviewed the layout of the mansion one final time, memorizing the details Samuel had observed through his telescope. The main entrance was heavily guarded, but there was a service entrance on the north side that seemed less well protected. If she could reach that without being seen, she might be able to get inside while attention was focused on Samuel's dramatic arrival at the front gate. "Remember," Samuel said as they prepared to separate. If something goes wrong, if I don't come out or if the plan falls apart, you take that evidence and ride hard for Denver. Find Marshall Williams and pray he's one of the honest ones. And what if he's not? Then you keep riding until you find someone who is. Someone has to know the truth about what's been happening out here. Lydia nodded, though they both knew the chances of her escaping alone if the plan failed were virtually non-existent. Crow had too many men, knew the territory too well, and had too much invested in keeping his secrets buried. But the alternative was to spend the rest of their lives running, always looking over their shoulders, never knowing when the Crimson Hand would finally catch up to them. Lydia, Samuel said as she prepared to circle around to the north side of the mansion. If we don't make it out of this, we will. If we don't, he continued firmly, I want you to know that these past few days, they've reminded me that there's more to life than revenge. That maybe, when this is over, there might be something worth living for. She looked at him for a long moment, this dark stranger who had risked everything to free her from chains, who had listened to her story without judgment, who was now prepared to walk into almost certain death to finish what her father had started. When this is over, she said quietly, we'll find out together. Then she was gone, moving like a shadow through the rocks and brush, heading for the northern approach to the mansion. Samuel waited until he could no longer see her, then began his own descent toward the main gate, leading his horse and carrying the false evidence that would hopefully convince Crow he was just another bounty hunter looking to collect a reward. The guards spotted him when he was still a quarter-mile away. Samuel could see them moving along the walls, rifles ready, as he approached at a steady walk with his hands visible and his manner relaxed. He had to appear confident but not threatening, eager but not desperate, the demeanor of a man who knew he was carrying valuable cargo and expected to be well paid for it. That's far enough, stranger, one of the guards called out when Samuel was perhaps 50 yards from the gate. State your business. Samuel reined in his horse and raised his voice to carry across the distance. Name's Porter, Jake Porter. I got something here I think Mr. Crow's gonna want to see. Something he's been looking for a real long time. Yeah? What might that be? The Thornton girl, Lydia Mae Thornton herself, trussed up nice and neat in my saddlebags. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Guards who had been lounging in the shadows suddenly snapped to attention. Voices called out urgent instructions, and Samuel could see men running to report this development to their superiors. Within minutes, the heavy wooden gate swung open, and a group of armed riders emerged to escort him inside. The leader was a lean man with cold eyes and prematurely gray hair, wearing clothes that were too fine for the frontier but marked with the dust and wear of hard travel. Samuel recognized him from wanted posters, Marcus Graves, Crow's lieutenant and right-hand man. Well, well, Graves said, riding up close enough to study Samuel's face. Jake Porter, you said? Can't say I've heard the name. Bounty hunting's a competitive business, Samuel replied with a shrug. Smart man doesn't advertise too much. True enough. So you claim you've got the Thornton girl? Don't claim nothing. Got her right here. Samuel gestured toward his saddlebags, which had been carefully arranged to suggest they contained a bound and unconscious prisoner. Took me 3 months to track her down, but I finally cornered her at an old trading post near Socorro. Figured Mr. Crow would appreciate dealing with someone who gets results. Graves studied him for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether this was legitimate or some kind of trap. Samuel kept his expression neutral, projecting the confidence of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to gain. The boss has been looking for that particular woman for a long time, Graves said finally. You sure it's really her? Auburn hair, green eyes, about 20 years old with a scar on her left wrist from wearing shackles? Yeah, I'm sure. The detail about the scar, which was real, earned during Lydia's captivity, seemed to convince Graves. All right, Porter, the boss will want to see this for himself, but I'm warning you. If you're running some kind of game, if this isn't really the Thornton girl, you'll be feeding the coyotes before morning. Wouldn't dream of wasting Mr. Uncrow's time with anything less than the genuine article. The escort surrounded Samuel as they rode through the gates and into the courtyard of Raven Shallow Mansion. Up close, the building was even more impressive and more forbidding. The architecture was a mixture of Spanish colonial and territorial styles, with thick adobe walls pierced by narrow windows that looked more like firing slits than sources of light. Covered balconies ran along the upper levels, providing perfect positions for riflemen to cover the courtyard below. Samuel counted at least 30 men visible in the immediate area, all armed and alert. Guards patrolled the walls and towers. Servants hurried about their business with the efficient movements of people who knew that mistakes could be fatal. And everywhere there was an air of disciplined menace that spoke of an organization run with military precision. They dismounted in front of the main building, and Graves gestured for Samuel to follow him up a flight of stone steps to a pair of heavy wooden doors bound with iron. The doors swung open at their approach, revealing a hallway lined with portraits of men in expensive clothes and cold expressions, probably territorial politicians and business leaders who had found it profitable to work with the Crimson Hand. Wait here, Graves ordered, indicating a chair near the entrance. I'll tell the boss you're here. Don't touch anything, don't wander around, and don't even think about going for that gun unless you want to die very quickly. Samuel nodded and settled into the chair, projecting the patience of a professional waiting to conclude a business transaction. But his eyes were busy, cataloging details that might prove useful later. The layout of the hallway, the positions of the guards, the locations of doors and windows that might serve as escape routes. The building was richly appointed but cold, decorated with expensive furniture and artwork that had clearly been stolen from raids across the territory. Samuel recognized a painting that had hung in the lobby of a hotel in Santa Fe before the Crimson Hand had burned the building down during a robbery. There was something obscene about seeing it here. Displayed like a trophy in a criminal's private museum. After perhaps 10 minutes, Graves returned with news that sent a chill down Samuel's spine. The boss will see you now, but he wants to examine the merchandise first. Make sure you're not trying to pass off some other girl as the famous Lydia Thornton. This was the moment of truth. Samuel had prepared for this possibility, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. If Crow insisted on examining the supposed prisoner too closely, if he opened the saddlebags and found them filled with rocks and spare clothes instead of an unconscious woman, the game would be up before it had properly begun. "Course," Samuel said, standing and shouldering his saddlebags. "Man in his position can't be too careful." Graves led him deeper into the mansion, through hallways lined with more stolen artwork and guarded by men who watched every movement with professional suspicion. They passed several rooms that appeared to be offices or meeting chambers. Places where the business of the Crimson Hand was conducted with the same attention to detail that legitimate enterprises might bring to their operations. Finally, they reached a pair of double doors made of dark wood and decorated with intricate carvings. Graves knocked once, received permission to enter, and pushed the doors open to reveal the inner sanctum of the most dangerous man in the territory. Jeremiah Crow sat behind a massive oak desk in a room that looked more like a gentleman's study than an outlaw's headquarters. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that probably represented the contents of a dozen looted libraries. Oil paintings depicted scenes of wealth and power. Aristocrats in fine clothes, armies on parade, cities built on the bones of their enemies. But it was the man himself who commanded attention. Crow was perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair and beard meticulously groomed, wearing a dark suit that would not have looked out of place in the finest hotels of San Francisco or Denver. He might have been a banker or a territorial governor, except for the eyes, pale blue and utterly cold, the eyes of a man who had looked into darkness so long that he had become one with it. "Mr. Porter," Crow said, his voice cultured and soft, with just a hint of an accent that might have been Southern aristocracy. "Marcus tells me you've brought me a gift I've been waiting to receive for quite some time." "Yes, sir, Mr. Crow. Got her right here." Samuel patted his saddlebags. "Lydia May Thornton, delivered as promised." Crow stood and walked around the desk, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. "You understand. I'm sure that I must verify your claim. Miss Thornton is a rather valuable commodity. I wouldn't want to discover that I've paid good money for damaged goods. Naturally. Though I should mention, she didn't come easy. Had to use a bit of laudanum to keep her quiet for the journey. She might be a little groggy for a while." It was a calculated risk, an explanation for why the supposed prisoner might not be fully conscious or responsive. Crow nodded as if this was exactly what he would have expected. "Very professional. Mr. Porter, I appreciate a man who thinks ahead." Crow's pale eyes fixed on Samuel's face. "But I'm curious about something. In 2 years of hunting this particular woman, my organization has employed numerous bounty hunters, trackers, and professional assassins. None of them have succeeded in capturing her alive. What makes you different?" The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Samuel knew that his answer might determine whether he lived or died in the next few minutes. "Patience," he said simply. "Most hunters try to run her to ground, chase her like a rabbit. I figured out her pattern, learned where she felt safe, and waited for her to come to me. Woman's been running so long, she's developed habits you can exploit if you're smart enough to see them." Crow smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Interesting. And what pattern did you discover?" "She keeps going back to places connected to her father. Old campsites, towns where he served as marshal, people who knew him. Sentiment makes people predictable, and predictable people make easy targets." It was a plausible enough explanation, and one that played into what Crow would want to hear, that his enemy had been brought down by emotional weakness rather than superior force. "Well then," Crow said, moving closer to the saddlebags, "let's have a look at our famous fugitive, shall we?" Samuel's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his gun as Crow reached for the leather straps that secured the saddlebags. This was it, the moment when their desperate gamble would either pay off or get them both killed. And somewhere outside in the darkness, Lydia was making her own approach to the mansion, carrying the real evidence that could destroy everything Crow had built. If Samuel could just keep the man's attention for a few more minutes, if he could create enough chaos and confusion. Crow's fingers worked at the straps, and Samuel prepared to discover whether their plan was brilliant or simply the last mistake they would ever make. The saddlebags hit the floor with a dull thud, spilling their contents across the Persian rug in Crow's office. Rocks, spare clothing, and a few personal items scattered at the crime lord's feet, but no unconscious woman. No Lydia Thornton. Samuel's hand was already moving toward his gun when Crow's cold laugh filled the room. Well, Mr. Porter, if that's even your real name, It seems we have ourselves a situation. The guards flanking the doorway had their weapons drawn before Samuel could clear leather. Marcus Graves stepped forward, his own pistol aimed at Samuel's chest, a thin smile playing across his lips. "Should have known it was too good to be true," Graves said. "Nobody's been able to track down the Thornton girl for 2 years. And suddenly some nobody bounty hunter just walks up to our front door with her gift wrapped?" Samuel kept his hands visible, his mind racing. The plan had failed, but not completely. Somewhere outside in the darkness, Lydia was making her way toward the mansion with the real evidence. If he could just buy her enough time. "Smart man might wonder," Samuel said calmly, "why I'd be fool enough to walk into a place like this without some kind of insurance." Crow raised an eyebrow. "Insurance? The girl's close by, real close. And if I don't walk out of here in one piece, she's got instructions to take certain documents to Marshall Williams in Denver. Documents that might interest him considerably." It was a bluff, but a calculated one. Crow's network depended on secrecy and fear. The mere suggestion that incriminating evidence might surface would make him cautious, might buy the time they needed. "What kind of documents?" Crow asked, his voice deceptively casual. "The kind that name names, the kind that connect certain territorial officials to certain criminal activities, the kind that could hang a man." Crow studied Samuel's face for a long moment, then walked to the window overlooking the courtyard. "You know, Mr. Porter, or whoever you are, I've built my organization on a very simple principle. Information is power, and power, properly applied, is the only thing that matters in this world." He turned back to face Samuel, his pale eyes reflecting the lamplight like chips of ice. "So let me share some information with you. The documents you're referring to were hidden by Deputy Marshal Thomas Thornton before his untimely death. They're currently secreted somewhere in Mission San Miguel, about 40 miles north of here. And in precisely," he pulled out a gold pocket watch, 1 hour and 23 minutes. "That mission is going to burn to the ground, along with any evidence it might contain." Samuel felt his blood turn cold. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Marcus, would you care to enlighten our guest about tonight's activities?" Graves consulted his own timepiece. "Fire team left 2 hours ago. Should be in position right about now. Orders are to torch the whole place at midnight, then make sure nothing's left standing by dawn." The trap was even more elaborate than Samuel had realized. While he and Lydia had been planning their infiltration of the mansion, Crow had been preparing to destroy the evidence they were trying to retrieve. Worse, if Lydia was still at the mission. "You see," Crow continued, settling into a leather chair like a gentleman discussing the weather, "I've known about Thornton's little cache for quite some time. The problem has always been finding it without alerting the wrong people to its existence. But tonight, that problem solves itself. The mission burns due to a tragic accident. The evidence is destroyed, and the Thornton girl dies trying to retrieve her father's legacy. She's not at the mission. Oh, but she is. My men have been watching both of you for the past 3 days. They followed you from Mission San Miguel to this very location. A most touching display of devotion, really. Her attempting to rescue you while you attempt to rescue her." Samuel's mind reeled. Everything had been anticipated, every move countered before it was made. Crow had been playing them like pieces on a chessboard, maneuvering them exactly where he wanted them. "The beauty of it," Crow went on, "is that everyone gets what they deserve. You get to die for your presumption in challenging me. The girl gets to die for her father's sins. And I get to eliminate the last threat to my organization while making it look like a tragic accident." A knock at the office door interrupted his monologue. One of the guards opened it to admit a young man in dusty riding clothes, clearly a messenger who had ridden hard to get here. "Sir," the messenger said, slightly out of breath, "we've got a problem at the mission." Crow's expression didn't change, but Samuel noticed his fingers tighten on the arms of his chair. "What kind of problem?" "The fire team's under attack. Someone was waiting for them. Picked off 3 men before they knew what hit them. Charlie managed to get away. Rode here fast as he could to report." "How many attackers?" "Charlie thinks maybe 1, possibly 2. Professional work, though. Military precision." Samuel felt a surge of hope mixed with concern. Lydia had reached the mission and was fighting back, but she was outnumbered and outgunned. She needed help, and she needed it soon. "Interesting," Crow said, his voice betraying no emotion. "It seems our guests are more resourceful than anticipated." He stood and walked to a cabinet, withdrawing a bottle of fine whiskey and 2 glasses. "Marcus, take 6 men and ride to the mission immediately. Kill anyone you find there and make sure the building burns completely. No survivors, no evidence, no mistakes." "What about him?" Graves nodded toward Samuel. "Mr. Porter and I are going to have a more detailed conversation about his associates and their intentions. I suspect he knows more than he's been sharing." As Graves left to organize the reinforcements, Crow poured whiskey into both glasses and offered one to Samuel. "Drink?" "I don't drink with murderers." "How disappointing. I was hoping we could be civilized about this." Crow sipped his whiskey and returned to his chair. "Tell me, what's your real name? I like to know who I'm dealing with." Samuel saw no point in maintaining the deception. "Samuel Blackwood." For the first time since the conversation began, Crow showed genuine surprise. "Blackwood, as in Rebecca Blackwood." "My sister." "Ah." Crow set down his glass and leaned back in his chair. "Now I understand. The brother, seeking revenge for his poor dead sister. How wonderfully melodramatic." "You remember her?" "I remember them all. Mr. Blackwood, every face, every name, every delicious moment of fear before the end. Your sister was particularly memorable. Such spirit, such defiance. It took considerable effort to break her properly." Samuel's vision went red around the edges. His hands clenched into fists, and it took every ounce of his self-control not to lunge across the room at Crow's throat. "Does it help to know," Crow continued conversationally, "that she called for you at the end?" "Samuel," she cried. "Samuel, please help me." "Rather heartbreaking, really. I'm going to kill you. I'm sure you'd like to try. But first, let's discuss your companion. Miss Thornton is a remarkable young woman, intelligent, resourceful, surprisingly difficult to capture. I'm quite looking forward to making her acquaintance in person. She'll never let you take her alive, won't she? People say that, but they rarely mean it when the moment comes. The survival instinct is remarkably strong, even in the most determined individuals." Crow stood and walked to his desk, opening a drawer and withdrawing a small wooden box. Inside, cushioned in velvet, was a collection of items that made Samuel's stomach turn. Jewelry, hair ribbons, personal effects that could only have come from victims. "I keep mementos," Crow explained. "Reminders of particularly interesting encounters. Your sister's locket is in here somewhere." He rummaged through the contents. "Ah, here we are." He held up a small silver locket that Samuel recognized immediately. Their mother's locket, which Rebecca had worn every day since their parents' death. Seeing it in Crow's hands was like watching him desecrate their mother's grave. "Lovely piece," Crow said, examining it in the lamplight. I'm thinking Miss Thornton's effects will make a nice addition to the collection. Samuel forced himself to remain calm, to think strategically instead of emotionally. Crow was trying to provoke him, to make him do something rash that would end the conversation prematurely. But if Lydia was at the mission fighting for her life, every minute he could keep Crow talking was another minute she had to escape or find help. You made a mistake, Samuel said quietly. Did I? How so? You told me about the fire team, about Marcus riding to the mission with reinforcements. That means in about 2 hours, when they don't come back, you're going to start wondering what went wrong. Crow's smile faltered slightly. You seem remarkably confident that a young woman can stand against trained killers. You don't know Lydia Thornton. She's her father's daughter. And Thomas Thornton was the best lawman this territory ever saw. She's not some helpless victim you can intimidate and break. She's a fighter, and she's got nothing left to lose. We'll see about that. A commotion in the courtyard outside drew their attention to the window. Voices were calling out urgent instructions, and Samuel could see men running toward the stables. Something was happening, something that required immediate attention. Another messenger burst through the office door without bothering to knock. Sir, we just got word from the North Lookout. There's a fire at the mission, but it's not our fire. Someone set off explosions and there's shooting, lots of shooting. Crow's composure cracked slightly. Explosions? Looked like the bell tower went up first, then the main building. Charlie says it looks like a war zone out there. Samuel allowed himself a small smile. Lydia had found more than just her father's evidence at the mission. She'd found the cache of black powder and explosives that Thomas Thornton had hidden for exactly this kind of situation. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Sir, the messenger continued, what are your orders? Crow was silent for a long moment, staring out at the darkness beyond his window. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of grudging respect. It seems we've underestimated our opponents. Very well. Send word to all our contacts in the territorial government. Tell them the situation has become fluid. They may need to distance themselves from our organization for a time. He turned back to Samuel. As for you, Mr. Blackwood, I think it's time we concluded our business. You've been most educational, but I have more pressing matters to attend to. Samuel tensed, preparing for whatever was coming next. But before Crow could give any orders, another explosion lit up the northern horizon, closer this time, and powerful enough to rattle the windows of the mansion. Dear God, the messenger whispered, what is she doing out there? Samuel looked directly at Crow, and for the first time since entering the office, he smiled. She's finishing what her father started, and when she's done with the mission, she's coming for you. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the courtyard, riders coming fast from the direction of the mission. But these weren't Crow's men returning in triumph. These were survivors fleeing something they couldn't fight. The final battle was about to begin, and for the first time in 5 years, Samuel Blackwood believed he might actually live to see justice done. The first explosion shattered the pre-dawn stillness like the crack of doom itself. Windows throughout Raven Shallow Mansion rattled in their frames as a brilliant orange fireball bloomed on the horizon where Mission San Miguel had stood. The shockwave rolled across the desert, carrying with it the sound of collapsing stone and the distant screams of men caught in the inferno. Samuel felt the vibration through the floor of Crow's office and allowed himself a grim smile. Lydia had found her father's cache of black powder after all, and she was putting it to devastating use. The mission wasn't just burning, it was being systematically destroyed, taking with it any chance the Crimson Hand had of recovering the evidence hidden there. Crow stood frozen at his window, staring at the distant flames with an expression of dawning horror. For the first time since Samuel had met him, the crime lord's composure was completely shattered. "That's impossible," Crow whispered. "Marcus took 6 men, the best fighters in my organization. How could one woman—" A second explosion, larger than the first, lit up the darkness. This time, Samuel could see the flash clearly through the office window, followed by a pillar of fire that climbed toward the stars like a prayer for vengeance. "She's not just one woman," Samuel said quietly. "She's Thomas Thornton's daughter, and you should have killed her when you had the chance." Crow spun around, his pale eyes blazing with fury. "Kill him!" he snarled to the guards flanking the door. "Kill him now!" But before either guard could draw his weapon, a new sound reached them from the courtyard outside, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, dozens of horses riding hard toward the mansion. Through the window, Samuel could see torches moving in the darkness, a column of riders approaching at full gallop. "Sir!" The messenger who had brought news of the mission catastrophe burst through the door again, his face pale with terror. "Riders coming from the north. At least 30 of them, maybe more." "Who?" Crow demanded. "Who's riding toward my stronghold in the middle of the night?" "Can't tell, sir, but they're flying a flag. Looks like a federal marshal's banner." The color drained from Crow's face. A federal marshal's posse, here, now, in the aftermath of the mission's destruction. It could only mean one thing. Somehow, impossibly, word of the Crimson Hand's activities had reached honest lawmen. Samuel's smile widened. "I told you she was Thomas Thornton's daughter. You think she'd come here without backup?" The truth was even better than Samuel had dared hope. Before approaching the mansion, Lydia had managed to get word to Marshal Williams in Denver, along with copies of some of the most damning evidence from her father's cache. The federal authorities had been mobilizing even as Samuel walked into Crow's trap. "This isn't over," Crow snarled, reaching for the gun at his hip. "Even if the marshals are here, even if my organization falls, I can still—" His words were cut off by the sharp crack of a rifle shot from somewhere within the mansion itself. Then another, and another, as gunfire erupted throughout the building. Shouts of alarm echoed through the hallways, and Samuel could hear the sound of running feet as Crow's men scrambled to respond to threats from multiple directions. Lydia had made it inside. The guards at the office door turned toward the sounds of battle, momentarily distracted, and Samuel seized his chance. He lunged forward, driving his shoulder into the nearest guard's chest and sending the man crashing into his companion. Both guards went down in a tangle of limbs, their weapons clattering across the floor. Samuel rolled, came up with one of the fallen pistols, and found himself facing Crow across the width of the office. The crime lord had his own gun drawn, the barrel steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Samuel Blackwood," Crow said, his voice once again coldly controlled. "I should have realized. Thomas Thornton's investigation, Rebecca Blackwood's murder, Lydia Thornton's escape, all connected, all leading to this moment. You're finished, Crow. Your organization is falling apart. The marshals are here, and the evidence that will hang you is already in their hands. Perhaps. But I can still have the satisfaction of killing the man who destroyed everything I built." They faced each other across the room, two men separated by years of violence and loss, each knowing that only one would walk away from this confrontation. Outside, the sounds of battle grew louder as federal marshals engaged Crow's guards in the courtyard and hallways. "Tell me," Crow said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather instead of preparing to kill each other. "Was it worth it? All the planning, all the risk, All the death? Was your revenge worth destroying so many lives? This was never about revenge, Samuel replied. This was about justice, about making sure you could never hurt another innocent person. Justice? Crow laughed, a sound like breaking glass. There is no justice in this world, Mr. Blackwood. There is only power and the will to use it. I learned that lesson long ago when my own family was murdered by men who called themselves lawmen. Men who wore badges while they burned my home and killed my children. For a moment, something almost human flickered in Crow's pale eyes. You think you're so different from me? You've spent 5 years hunting and killing just as I have. The only difference is that you tell yourself you're doing it for a noble cause. The difference, Samuel said quietly, is that I never forgot the line between justice and murder. You crossed that line so long ago you can't even see it anymore. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps I am a monster. But I'm a monster this territory created, and now I'm its judgment upon itself. Crow's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, the office door exploded inward. Lydia Thornton stood in the doorway, her dress torn and stained with smoke, a rifle in her hands and determination burning in her green eyes. It's over, Crow, she said simply. The crime lord's head turned toward her, and in that instant of distraction, Samuel struck. His shot took Crow high in the chest, spinning the man around and sending him crashing into the bookshelf behind his desk. Leather-bound volumes tumbled to the floor, their pages scattered like fallen leaves. Crow slumped against the wall, his gun falling from nerveless fingers. Blood stained his expensive shirt, but his eyes remained fixed on Lydia with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. Thomas Thornton's daughter, he wheezed. Should have killed you. Years ago. You tried, Lydia replied, moving closer but keeping her rifle ready. But you underestimated what a father's love could accomplish. Papa knew this day would come, and he prepared for it. Crow coughed, blood speckling his lips. The evidence. You think it will make a difference? The corruption goes deeper than you know. Maybe, but it's a start. And sometimes, that's all you can do. Make a start and trust others to finish the work. The sounds of gunfire were dying down outside, replaced by authoritative voices calling for surrender. Through the window, Samuel could see federal marshals moving through the courtyard, their badges glinting in the torchlight as they rounded up the surviving members of the Crimson Hand. Crow's breathing was becoming labored, but his eyes remained sharp. You won't live to see the trials. Too many people, with too much to lose. Then we'll have to make sure the truth gets out before they can silence us, Samuel said. He moved to the desk and began gathering the papers scattered across its surface, documents that might provide additional evidence of the corruption network. A knock at the door interrupted them. Federal marshals, open up. It's clear, Lydia called out, but we need a doctor. The door opened to admit a tall man with graying hair and a badge that identified him as Marshal Williams himself. Behind him came 2 deputies, their weapons drawn but lowered when they saw the situation was under control. Miss Thornton, Williams said, holstering his pistol. I got your message. Rode here as fast as I could with every honest lawman I could find. Marshal Williams, thank God you came. Lydia's voice was steady, but Samuel could see the exhaustion in her eyes. We have everything. All the evidence Papa gathered, plus more that we found here. Williams looked at Crow, who was still conscious but fading fast. Jeremiah Crow, I've been hunting you for 10 years. And now, you have me, Crow managed, but the victory is hollow. Cut off 1 head, and 2 more will take its place. Maybe, Williams agreed. But we'll keep cutting until there are no more heads to grow back. One of the deputies knelt beside Crow, checking his wound. He's not going to make it, Marshal. Lost too much blood. Williams nodded grimly. Then we'd better get his confession while we can. Mr. Crow, you're under arrest for murder, robbery, conspiracy, and about a dozen other charges. If you have anything to say in your defense, now would be the time. Crow's laugh turned into a coughing fit. Defense? I have no defense, and no regrets. I did what I thought necessary. His eyes found Samuel one last time. Your sister. She was brave, at the end, braver than I gave her credit for. Those were Jeremiah Crow's last words. The leader of the Crimson Hand died as the sun rose over the New Mexico territory, bringing an end to one of the most violent chapters in the region's history. Marshal Williams stood slowly, removing his hat in a gesture of respect for the dead. Not for Crow, but for all the innocent lives that had been lost in the long hunt for justice. It's finished, he said quietly. No, Lydia replied, looking out the window at the dawn light painting the desert in shades of gold and red. It's just beginning. We have work to do, trials to prepare for, corruption to root out, people to protect. Samuel moved to stand beside her at the window. In the distance, he could see the smoke still rising from the ruins of Mission San Miguel, a funeral pyre for the secrets that had died there. But here, in this room where so much evil had been planned and executed, something new was being born. What happens now? He asked. Now we rebuild, Lydia said. We take what Papa started and we finish it. We make sure that no one else has to wear chains, real or otherwise, because evil men think they're above the law. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly toward the horizon, beautiful and harsh and full of promise. Somewhere out there, other outlaws were already planning to fill the void left by the Crimson Hand's destruction. Other corrupt officials were calculating how to protect their interests. Other innocent people were living in fear. But for the first time in years, Samuel Blackwood felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Not just for revenge or justice, but for something better. Something worth building instead of destroying. He looked at Lydia, this remarkable woman who had survived 2 years of hell and emerged stronger for it, who had turned her pain into purpose and her fear into determination. Well then, he said, offering her his arm as they prepared to leave the scene of their victory. I suppose we'd better get to work. As they walked out of Raven Shallow Mansion and into the light of a new day, neither of them was wearing chains. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, that freedom felt not like an ending but like a beginning.